I found the chapter on shopping particularly fascinating because you zoom in on the shopping mall as a kind of theatre of activity, and you distinguish shopping from buying, and you distinguish cash from credit. And I thought it was a very interesting sort of nexus you had there. Can you say a little bit about what's going on?
That's right. It's quite a simple division, but I think it helps to think about what's going on. So the mall is a kind of market, isn't it, insofar as we go and buy stuff in it. But I think it's very different from being a simple evolution of the market that you might have gone to in a medieval town square, where there's a free interchange of goods and bartering and social intercourse and so on. Because I think the mall is more about inhibiting personal interchange. So that's the first point. The mall is not about the market in the old sense. A second point is, yes, in the mall, the currency in the mall, while being money, has to be the credit card rather than cash. And actually cash in a mall is a rather foreign object. And that's because, again, there's something about the mall which is so committed to clean, odourless interchange. And it's very well captured by the symbol of the credit card, which is plastic. And is something you retain. When you hand over cash, you literally hand over notes to somebody else, and you're fingering the paper substance that somebody else has fingered in turn. So in this sense, I think we're in a completely new era of consumption. When one goes to the mall, one shops. And as part of that, one shops for what one wants. Whereas previously, to talk about it very schematically, one would go to buy things that one needed. And I think that's the distinction. In the market, you buy what you need. In a mall, you shop for what you want. And I think that, we're beyond the watershed where those two have split.
To go back to Sartre and his bad faith, I suppose a lot of the book is thinking about ways in which we can realise ourselves. And I guess you would say that in the shopping mall, that's an artificial form of self-realisation because it's kind of borrowing against some future ideal of ourselves that is never attainable. Is that true?
Absolutely. Just on this notion of the self and what it means to be a self, again, I think there are two concepts that I would support. One is the idea that we must own ourselves and own ourselves over and against anybody else's ownership of ourselves, be that a state or a party or a culture and so on. But having said that, I think there is always a point at which our self-ownership runs out. We can only ever assimilate or know ourselves so much. And again, I return to either the psychoanalytic notion of the unconscious, where we can't assimilate or capture all that we are, or I guess a more philosophical notion from the Continental Tradition, that part of us is riven by what you might call the other. Sounds very grandiose, but I think there is a strong sense in which an otherness will always escape us in some way. We won't ever necessarily coincide with ourselves completely. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because from that non-closure of the self, the interruption of the self by itself, the self then opens out and enters into the future and enters into contingency and chance and so on, all the things that would have been foreclosed if we were entirely identical to ourselves.
Yes, chance and contingency and randomness seemed to me another theme that was running through the book, something that you sort of prized as part of what made us human.
Absolutely, and in that, the book rests on two very classical pillars. You'll know the Greeks loved their distinction between chance on the one hand and necessity on the other. And I think it's pretty true to say that the necessity tradition has been the dominant one. And I guess I'm just keen to reintroduce notions of chance, because no matter what theories we have about the world, wherever we are, they're never the final one. There's always more future to come. And that means our mastery of the present is always going to be somewhat circumscribed. But rather than lamenting that fact, I think that's an opportunity for us to be innovative in our thinking and to welcome in new forms, not just of thinking, but of art in particular and the aesthetic. And I think the aesthetic opens out from where chance comes in, really. And I guess those are where my prejudices probably lie.
Tell me about, you mentioned the Continental Tradition a moment ago. Tell me about the appeal of that, because it's noticeable the Anglo-Saxon analytic tradition is not highly represented in the book, perhaps for obvious reasons. But do you think the Continental Tradition addresses these questions which fascinate you in a particularly fruitful, revealing, useful way?
I do, and no doubt that's for perfectly ordinary autobiographical reasons. I started out as a student of English at Oxford, and at that time, in the mid-'80s, it was very fashionable to study literary theory. Once you get into literary theory, you cross the channel pretty quickly, and once you're on the channel, this new world opens up, and you're surrounded by the Foucaults, the Derridas, the Baudrillards, the Blanchots, and so on. And one is really talking a different language at that point. And although it seems pretty weird, you then realise that language has antecedents which go back a very long way. I mean, Hegel is the obvious person to refer back to. So that's the kind of autobiographical aspect of it. Do I think they can reveal things differently? Absolutely, I do. I guess ultimately what one wants, naively perhaps, is to somehow produce a more integrated idiom that can use British empiricism, can use continental philosophy, and, as it were, gets the best of both. And I say that partly for institutional reasons. I mean, anybody who studied philosophy in this country will know that the walls around it are very, very high, and the kind of academic policing of boundaries is pretty intense, and to my view, pretty futile. I mean, I don't see any reason at all for academics, other than small p political reasons, for academics to maintain those boundaries. I think intellectual life should be, like a free state, as porous as possible. That's the main kind of intellectual reason for believing in that.
Now, I know that one of the hats you wear is as a management consultant, and I wondered if you deploy, Hegel and Walter Benjamin and Lacan's mirror stage when you're doing that. I mean, subtly perhaps, but does this all come into play when you're discussing, how to run a company?
Short answer is not very much, and it's pretty latent when it's there at all. But increasingly, now that my clients know I have this furtive moonlighting life where I, slip on my black polo neck in the evening and go off to read Being and Nothingness, they are increasingly asking me to introduce rather than suppress that kind of material. And that happens in one of two ways. Either they'll ask for a kind of freestanding insert on Descartes or something, or more typically I'll just try and weave it into some of the work I do or use it to illustrate a point. Let me give you an example. So I've been working a reasonable amount with the NHS recently, and in that work I've drawn on some work by a psychoanalytic social scientist called Isabel Mingy's-Lythe, who talks about the ways in which all hospitals are built on defending themselves against the horrors that go on within. So if you're in an acute ward in particular, you're dealing with blood and guts and all sorts of nasty, human expressions of themselves. And the other thing you will see in a hospital is an extraordinary level of cleanliness and order, even bureaucracy. And what this lady, Isabel Mingy's-Lythe, argues is the order and neatness in a hospital is a defensive response to the chaos and blood and guts all around. So the hospital actually operates on these on that tension, if you like. And so I've used that example and spoken around it with some of my NHS clients, and it just helps move the conversation along or reframes an issue. That's not the answer, but it provides new lenses on the work they do.
Last question, Robert. I wondered, if the book is in a sense a sort of call to us to wake up and to live and think more authentically, is the kind of governing metaphor for how you think we are at the moment the slowly boiling frog? Because there is a slowly boiling frog in the book, and I thought, when I came across that, my eyes sort of went like that, and I thought, is this perhaps the condition which you think we are, to mix metaphors, sort of sleepwalking into?
It's very, very good, very helpful. It's either a slowly boiled frog or a slowly boiled egg, isn't it? Which is on the front cover of the book, for those who haven't seen it. Yes, I think the egg frog is slowly boiling, and here's me doing my Jeremiad for a moment. I do think there is a sense in which the ways in which we are given to think about the world seem to be becoming more uniform and more singular, and that's not a good thing. And I think we need to pluralize the ways we think about the world, because by doing that we create new ideas, we create more freedom, we create a future for ourselves.
Robert Rowland Smith. Breakfast with Socrates is out now in paperback. That's all for this edition of the Blackwell podcast, but you can find out more about the featured title, as well as several million others, by going to the Blackwell's website at blackwell.co.uk. There's also a podcast archive there with around 100 interviews to explore. I hope you'll join me again soon for another Blackwell's Online podcast. And until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.